The train jerked as it passed through the tunnel, and the old man, struggling to keep his balance, stumbled forward. His walker skidded, the tennis balls on its legs scraping against the floor as he held on to the nearest pillar. But it wasn't enough. He stumbled, losing his balance and accidentally bumping into Allie. She flinched, her arms flailing as if he'd just spilled coffee on her. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice rising above the din of the subway car. "Can't you, maybe don't take the train if you can't even stand up straight?" Her voice was sharp, loud enough for everyone around her to hear. Heads turned, passengers glancing quickly at the scene before looking away, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and silent judgment. But Allie didn't notice, or care. She was too preoccupied with her own frustration. That's an introduction to my story. If you find it interesting, please give me a channel subscription so I have the motivation to create more good stories. Thank you. I will continue the story now. The 6 train screeched into the station like a restless beast, its arrival heralded by a gust of stale air that carried the familiar metallic tang of the subway. It was rush hour, and the platform at 14th Street was a cacophony of clattering heels, muffled announcements, and the faint hum of a street performer's saxophone somewhere near the stairwell. People pushed closer to the edge, their eyes flicking toward the tunnel, scanning for the train as if sheer willpower could speed it up. Amid the chaos, she stood. Allie, young, stylish, and impatient, leaned against the metal pole near the edge of the platform. Her black leather bag, embossed with a subtle designer logo, hung from her shoulder, and her oversized sunglasses perched carelessly atop her head. Even underground, where the light was dim and fluorescent, she carried herself with an air of indifference, as if nothing in the world could bother her, except maybe the late train. Her phone buzzed in her hand, another text from her roommate about forgetting to buy coffee filters. Allie rolled her eyes, her manicured thumb swiping a half-hearted reply before stuffing the phone back into her coat pocket. She glanced at the crowd around her, a mix of faces, office workers, students, construction crews, a few tourists clutching subway maps like life rafts. She always found this mix fascinating, not because she cared, but because it was easy to guess what kind of day someone was having by the way they stood. The tired slouch of a man in a suit, the harried shuffle of a mother trying to keep her toddler in check. The blank stares of those who rode this train every day, so numb to the routine they could do it blindfolded. The train's headlights finally appeared, twin orbs of light cutting through the darkness. A collective shuffle spread through the crowd as people adjusted their positions, shoulders brushing, heads turning. The train slowed, brakes whining in protest, and the car doors slid open with a hiss. Allie was one of the first to step inside. She hated the crush of bodies, the feeling of being pressed between strangers like a sardine in a tin, so she always fought to grab a spot near the door. She claimed her place by the pole, gripping it with one hand while her other fished her phone back out for another scroll through social media. Around her, people filed in, squeezing into every available inch of space. The familiar smells of the subway filled the air: sweat, coffee, a faint whiff of something fried from someone's takeout bag. The train jolted as it began to move, and Allie reflexively tightened her grip on the pole. She glanced up briefly, her gaze sweeping the faces around her. Nothing unusual. A man in a Yankees cap was reading a paperback. A woman with a baby strapped to her chest was humming softly, her eyes half closed. 2 teenagers were laughing over something on one of their phones. Just another day. But then he stepped in. It was at the next stop, 23rd Street, when the old man entered the car. Allie noticed him immediately, not because he was doing anything unusual, but because he moved so differently from everyone else. Where others hurried, darting in and out of the car like fish in a stream, he shuffled. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step required careful calculation. He wore a long gray overcoat, frayed at the cuffs, and a flat cap pulled low over his white hair. His hands gripped a walker, one of those clunky metal frames with worn tennis balls on the back legs to help it slide across the floor. The crowd parted for him at first, but only slightly. A few people muttered under their breath as he took his time stepping over the gap between the platform and the train. One man even sighed audibly, glancing at his watch as if to say, "Hurry up, old man." Allie watched him with mild curiosity, but mostly annoyance. She hated slow people. Slow walkers, slow drivers, slow talkers. It wasn't personal. She just didn't have the patience. The old man finally made it inside, and the doors slid shut behind him. The train jolted again, causing him to stumble slightly. He caught himself on the nearest pole, gripping it with knobby fingers that were spotted with age. His walker clattered slightly, the tennis ball scraping against the floor. Allie could feel her irritation rising. She glanced at the man, then at the space he was taking up. The train was already packed, and now this guy was making it even harder for people to move. "Ugh," she muttered under her breath, loud enough for the girl next to her to hear. The girl gave her a quick glance but said nothing. The old man maneuvered himself closer to the door, but the train's constant lurching made it difficult. He accidentally bumped into a younger man in a hoodie, who responded with an annoyed grunt. The man didn't say anything, but he shifted away quickly, as if the old man were contagious. By now, Allie was watching him openly, her irritation plain on her face. She saw him glance around the car, his eyes scanning the faces of the passengers. For a moment, his gaze landed on her. His eyes were sharp, surprisingly sharp for someone his age. And for a brief second, Allie felt something almost like recognition pass between them. But then the moment was gone, and he turned away, his attention back on steadying himself. The train jolted again as it sped through the tunnel, and this time the old man lost his balance completely. He stumbled forward, his walker clattering uselessly to the side. Instinctively, Allie moved back, her hands flying up to shield herself. "Are you kidding me?" she snapped, her voice cutting through the low hum of the subway car. "Can you not, maybe don't take the train if you can't even stand up straight?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't care. She was frustrated, tired and fed up with being jostled around. The old man straightened slowly, his face calm but weary. He didn't respond. He just nodded slightly, muttering something under his breath that Allie couldn't hear. The car fell silent. For a moment, it was as if the entire train had collectively held its breath. Allie felt the weight of eyes on her, passengers turning to look at the source of the commotion. But no one said anything. They just watched, their expressions a mix of discomfort and indifference. The old man steadied himself again, gripping the pole tightly. He didn't look at Allie this time. Instead, he focused on the floor, his face unreadable. Allie shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how quiet the car had become. She looked around, but no one met her gaze. The train roared into the next station, and the sound broke the tension like a glass shattering on tile. The old man shuffled toward the door as it opened, his walker scraping against the floor. He stepped out slowly, disappearing into the crowd on the platform. Allie watched him go, a strange unease settling in her chest. She shook it off quickly, dismissing it as nothing more than the usual awkwardness of a public outburst. But something about the way he had looked at her, so calm, so steady, stayed with her. She didn't know why, but it made her feel small, insignificant, like she was just one tiny piece of a much larger story she couldn't yet understand. It was a typical New York morning, chaotic, loud, and full of people. You know the kind of morning I'm talking about, where you're squeezed so tightly into a subway car that you can feel someone else's breath on your neck. Everyone's tired, cranky, and in a hurry. That's exactly how it started. I was riding the train to work when I saw this girl, mid-20s maybe, dressed in designer everything, standing near the door with her earbuds in. She looked annoyed, like the whole world was getting on her nerves. At the next stop, an elderly man shuffled onto the train. He had one of those walkers with the tennis balls on the feet. His movements were painfully slow, like every step hurt. The train jolted as he tried to steady himself, but no one moved to help him. The girl rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath, something about how people like him shouldn't be taking the subway. She didn't bother saying it quietly either. The man didn't respond. He just kept struggling to find a spot to stand. I couldn't tell if he didn't hear her or if he just chose to ignore her. That night, as Allie sat in her tiny apartment scrolling through her messages, her mom called. "Hey, Mom," Allie said, balancing the phone between her shoulder and ear as she rifled through the fridge. "Hey, honey, how was your day?" Allie hesitated, her hand hovering over a carton of leftover takeout. Should she tell her mom about the subway incident? Maybe talking about it would help her make sense of the strange feeling she couldn't shake. "It was fine," she said finally. "Actually, there was this thing on the train today. Kind of weird, but never mind." "What happened?" her mom asked, her voice suddenly curious. Allie sighed. "There was this old guy. He had a walker and he was moving really slow and, I don't know, I guess I kind of snapped at him." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Did he say anything to you?" her mom asked, her tone unusually serious. "No," Allie said. "Why? What did he look like?" Allie frowned, leaning against the counter. "I don't know. Old. White hair. He had a cane and a walker. Kind of looked like he'd seen better days." "Why?" Her mom's voice was quiet when she spoke again. "Honey, did he have a cap? Like a flat cap? And was he wearing a gray coat?" Allie's chest tightened. "Yeah, why?" There was another long pause. Then her mom said, "I think that might have been Richard." "Richard who?" "Richard, your great-grandfather's cousin, the one I told you about, the war hero." Allie felt her stomach drop. "No way," she said. "That's not possible. Why would he be on the subway?" Her mom sighed. "Richard's always been humble. He doesn't like attention. He lives in the Bronx, you know, and he still takes the train sometimes. I told you about him years ago, but you probably don't remember." Allie's mind raced, trying to piece it together. Could it really have been him? The thought sent a wave of guilt crashing over her. "Mom, what if it was him?" she whispered. "Well," her mom said gently, "if it was, I think you know what you need to do." Allie barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the old man's face, the way he'd looked at her, calm, steady, unbothered, like he knew something she didn't. And now, knowing who he might be, that look felt like something else entirely. It felt like disappointment. The next morning, Allie woke up with a knot in her stomach. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone, debating whether to call her mom back. She needed to know more about Richard. The possibility that the man she'd insulted on the subway was her great-grandfather's cousin was too much to ignore. But at the same time, she dreaded confirming it. What if it really was him? What would she even do? After pacing around her tiny apartment for what felt like hours, she finally called her mom. "Morning, Allie." Her mom answered, her voice chipper. "Did you sleep well?" "Not really," Allie admitted, biting her lip. "I can't stop thinking about what you said last night. About Richard. Can you tell me more about him?" There was a pause on the other end. "I told you a lot about him when you were younger, but I guess you didn't pay much attention. He's a remarkable man. He was a tank operator in World War II. Fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Saved his entire unit when their tank was ambushed by German forces." Allie's stomach tightened as her mom continued. "He was injured, took a bullet to the leg, but he kept going. He pulled 2 of his comrades out of the tank before it exploded. He's a real hero, Allie. But he's always been humble about it. He doesn't like talking about the war. He says he just did what he had to do." Allie swallowed hard. "And he lives in the Bronx?" "Yes," her mom said. "He's lived there for years. Your great-grandfather was close to him. They grew up together. Richard was always like a second brother to him." Her mom's words hit Allie like a punch to the gut. She thought about the old man on the subway, his walker, his slow movements, the look in his eyes. It all fit. It had to be him. After hanging up the phone, Allie couldn't focus on anything else. She couldn't just let this go, not without knowing for sure. She had to find him. She started with a Google search. Richard plus World War II veteran plus Bronx. A few articles popped up, most of them old, but one caught her eye. It was a feature from a local newspaper, published several years ago, about a veteran named Richard Sullivan. The article described his bravery during the war and included a photo of him as a young man in uniform. Allie stared at the photo. There was something familiar about his face, even in black and white. She scrolled down and found a more recent photo, a grainy image of an elderly man at a veterans event, wearing a flat cap and a gray coat. Her breath caught. It was him. She was sure of it. The article mentioned that Richard often visited a small park near his apartment in the Bronx. That was her next step. The following morning, Allie took the train to the Bronx. As she stepped off the subway and into the crisp autumn air, she felt a wave of nerves wash over her. What was she even going to say to him? How could she possibly explain herself? The park was small and quiet, tucked away from the bustling streets. She scanned the benches looking for him, her heart pounding in her chest. And then she saw him. He was sitting under a large oak tree, feeding pigeons from a small paper bag. His walker was parked beside him and he wore the same gray coat and flat cap. For a moment, Allie froze. Seeing him again felt surreal, like she'd stepped into a dream, or a nightmare. She stood there for a long time, watching him from a distance. He looked peaceful, almost content, as the pigeons pecked at the breadcrumbs he scattered on the ground. Finally, she gathered her courage and walked over. Her footsteps felt heavy, and the closer she got, the harder it was to breathe. "Excuse me," she said softly. He looked up, squinting against the sunlight. His sharp blue eyes met hers, and she felt that same strange sense of recognition she'd felt on the train. "Yes?" he said, his voice calm but wary. Allie hesitated, her rehearsed words evaporating the moment she opened her mouth. I think I owe you an apology." He tilted his head, studying her. "Do I know you?" She took a deep breath. "We were on the subway together a few days ago. You were having trouble with your walker and I said something I shouldn't have, something rude." His expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to soften. "I remember," he said simply. Allie's heart sank. He remembered. Of course he remembered. How could he not? "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know about everything you've done. My mom told me about you, about the war and what you did, and how you're part of our family. I feel terrible." For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and unreadable. Then he sighed and set the paper bag of breadcrumbs on his lap. "Young lady," he began, his voice low but firm. "You didn't know who I was, but that doesn't matter. You shouldn't treat anyone like that, whether they're a war hero or not." Allie felt a lump rise in her throat. "I know," she said quietly. "I was impatient and I wasn't thinking. I was wrong." Richard nodded slowly. "We all have moments like that, but it's what you do afterward that counts." He gestured to the bench beside him. "Sit down." Allie hesitated, then sat. For a moment they were both silent, watching the pigeons. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," Richard said finally. "Quick to judge, quick to speak, but life has a way of humbling you." He began to tell her stories. About the war, about his comrades, about the day he saved his unit. His voice was steady, but there was a heaviness in his words, a weight that spoke of loss and sacrifice. Allie listened intently, hanging on every word. She felt her guilt deepen with each story, but she also felt something else, a sense of awe, of respect. By the time he finished, the sun was beginning to set. As Allie stood to leave, she turned to Richard and said, "Thank you for everything, not just for your service, but for giving me a second chance to make things right." He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Take care of yourself, young lady, and remember, kindness doesn't cost anything." Allie walked away feeling lighter but also profoundly changed. The encounter had shaken her, but it had also opened her eyes. She vowed to carry Richard's lessons with her, to treat people with patience and respect, no matter who they were. That night, Allie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face, his calm demeanor, the quiet strength in his voice as he told her stories of the war. But most of all, she saw the look he'd given her on the subway. That moment had been brief, but now it haunted her. The way his sharp blue eyes had seemed to pierce through her, as though he knew exactly who she was, not just her name but her character, her flaws. It was as if he'd seen every impatient remark she'd ever made, every dismissive glance, every time she'd put her own convenience above someone else's dignity. She groaned and rolled over, burying her face in her pillow. Why couldn't she just let it go? People snapped at each other on the subway all the time. It was practically a New York tradition. Why was this bothering her so much? But deep down she knew why. The subway scene played out in her mind like a film on repeat. She saw herself standing there, her arms crossed, her expression annoyed. She heard her own voice, sharp and cutting, as she snapped at Richard. She remembered the way he'd stumbled, how his walker had clattered against the floor. She hadn't even thought about helping him. That was the part that stung the most. In that moment, she hadn't seen him as a person, just an inconvenience. And now, knowing who he was, she couldn't stop thinking about how wrong she'd been. But it wasn't just guilt she was feeling. There was something else, something deeper. A sense of shame, not just for what she'd done, but for who she was, or who she'd been up until now. The next day, Allie walked through the city in a fog. The usual sights and sounds, the honking taxis, the street vendors shouting about hot dogs and pretzels, the distant hum of construction, felt muted like she was moving through a dream. She found herself watching people more closely than usual. She noticed the woman struggling to carry groceries up the subway stairs, the man in a wheelchair waiting for someone to hold the door, the elderly couple shuffling slowly across the crosswalk. Normally, she wouldn't have given them a second thought. But now she couldn't stop thinking about Richard. How many times had she ignored someone who needed help? How many times had she chosen convenience over compassion? Her guilt began to take on a life of its own, growing larger with each passing hour. It was like a shadow that followed her everywhere, whispering in her ear, reminding her of what she'd done. That evening, Allie sat at her kitchen table with a notebook in front of her. She hadn't used it in years. It was an old journal she'd bought in college and never finished. She flipped through the pages, scanning the half-formed thoughts and doodles, before finally settling on a blank page. She picked up a pen and started to write. "Dear Richard." The words came slowly at first, hesitant and unsure. But as she wrote, the floodgates opened. She poured her heart onto the page, confessing everything, her impatience, her thoughtlessness, her shame. She wrote about how much his stories had moved her, how they had changed the way she saw the world. By the time she finished, the page was filled with tiny, slanted handwriting. She set the pen down and stared at the letter. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it felt like a step in the right direction. The next day, she mailed it to the address her mom had given her. The days that followed were some of the longest of Allie's life. Every time her phone buzzed or a letter arrived in the mail, her heart jumped. But there was no response from Richard. She started to wonder if she'd made a mistake. What if the letter had come across as insincere? What if he thought she was just trying to ease her own guilt? Her mind spun with doubts, each one worse than the last. But no matter how much she second-guessed herself, there was no taking it back. All she could do now was wait. A week later, Allie found herself back in the Bronx. She wasn't sure why she'd gone. It wasn't like she was expecting to see Richard again. But something had drawn her there. A nagging feeling she couldn't ignore. She walked through the park where they'd met, her eyes scanning the benches. At first, she didn't see him. But just as she was about to leave, she spotted him under the same oak tree, his walker parked beside him. Her heart leapt into her throat. She considered walking away. Maybe he didn't want to see her again. But before she could decide, he looked up and saw her. "Allie," he said, his voice steady. She froze. How did he know her name? Richard reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was her letter. I got this a few days ago, he said, unfolding it carefully. I wasn't sure if I'd see you again. Allie took a hesitant step forward. Did you read it? He nodded. I did. And? Richard gave her a long, measured look. Then he smiled, a small, quiet smile that seemed to hold a world of meaning. I think you're starting to understand, he said. They talked for hours that day. Richard told her more about his life, his family, his experiences during the war, the friends he'd lost. He spoke about resilience, about the importance of small acts of kindness, about how every decision, no matter how small, can have a ripple effect. Allie listened intently, her guilt slowly giving way to something else, a sense of purpose. She realized that while she couldn't change the past, she could change the way she lived moving forward. By the time they said goodbye, she felt lighter. The guilt was still there, but it no longer felt like a weight she had to carry alone. That evening, Allie walked home through the city, her mind buzzing with thoughts. She stopped at the subway station and watched as people moved through the turnstiles, each one absorbed in their own world. She spotted an older woman struggling to carry a suitcase down the stairs. Without hesitating, Allie walked over and offered to help. The woman smiled gratefully, and as they reached the bottom of the stairs, Allie felt a small spark of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The following week, Allie found herself standing outside Richard's apartment building in the Bronx, clutching a small bag in her trembling hands. The bag contained a few simple gifts: a loaf of freshly baked bread from a local bakery, a tin of tea, and a handwritten note she had spent days perfecting. It wasn't much, but she hoped it was enough to show him how sorry she was. The street was quiet, save for the occasional rumble of a passing bus or the distant chatter of neighbors on their stoops. The late afternoon sun bathed the brownstone buildings in a warm golden glow, but Allie felt none of its warmth. Her stomach churned with nerves, and her palms were clammy as she gripped the bag tighter. She had spent the entire subway ride rehearsing what she wanted to say, but now, standing here, her mind felt like a blank slate. What if he didn't want to see her? What if she made things worse by showing up unannounced? For a moment, she considered turning around and walking away. But then she thought about Richard, his steady gaze, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he had calmly told her she needed to do better. She took a deep breath and walked up the steps to his building. The door was old and heavy, its brass knocker dulled with age. Allie hesitated before pressing the buzzer, her finger hovering over it for a moment too long. Finally, she pressed it, the sound echoing faintly through the building. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Just as she was about to give up, the intercom crackled to life. Hello? The voice was unmistakable, calm, measured, and familiar. Hi, Richard, Allie said, her voice shaking slightly. It's Allie. I was hoping I could talk to you. There was a pause. Come on up, he said finally. The intercom buzzed and the door clicked open. The staircase was narrow and steep, and Allie's heart pounded with each step, not from exertion, but from the weight of what she was about to do. By the time she reached the third floor, she was out of breath, more from nerves than anything else. His door was slightly ajar, and she could see the edge of his walker through the gap. She knocked lightly, and he called out for her to come in. Richard was sitting in a worn armchair by the window, a book resting on his lap. He looked up as she entered, his expression calm but curious. Allie, he said, setting the book aside. What brings you here? She hesitated, clutching the bag in her hands like a lifeline. I wanted to apologize. Properly this time. He gestured to the chair across from him. Have a seat. Allie sat down, her heart hammering in her chest. She set the bag on the small coffee table between them and took a deep breath. Richard, she began, her voice trembling. I've been thinking a lot about what happened on the subway, about what I said and how I treated you. I was rude and impatient, and I didn't stop to think about what you might be going through. And now, knowing who you are, I feel even worse." Richard watched her silently, his hands folded in his lap. "I brought you this," she said, pushing the bag toward him. "It's not much, but I wanted to do something to show you that I'm sorry." He reached for the bag, his movements slow but deliberate. He opened it and looked inside, then set it down with a small smile. "Thank you," he said simply. Allie's eyes filled with tears. "I know I can't undo what I said, but I want you to know that it's changed me. Meeting you, it's made me realize how thoughtless I've been, not just to you, but to a lot of people. I want to be better. I need to be better." For a long moment, Richard didn't say anything. He just looked at her, his piercing blue eyes studying her face as if searching for something. Finally, he spoke. "Allie," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and it takes even more courage to try to change. You've already taken the first step." She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "But let me tell you something," he continued. "You didn't hurt me with your words. I've been through enough in my life that I've learned not to take things like that personally. What hurt wasn't what you said. It was what it represented. The way we've all become so quick to judge, so quick to dismiss each other. That's what I want you to think about, not just for my sake, but for everyone's." Allie wiped her tears, his words sinking deep into her heart. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "You know," he said, "when I was your age, I thought I knew everything. I thought I was invincible. But war, it changes you. It makes you realize how fragile we all are, how much we need each other." He told her about the war again, but this time, he shared details he hadn't before, about the fear he felt in the moments before battle, the friends he lost, the quiet moments of camaraderie that kept them going. Allie listened intently, her heart breaking for the young man he had been and swelling with admiration for the man he had become. When their conversation finally came to an end, Richard stood with some effort and walked to a small shelf by the window. He picked up an old framed photo and handed it to her. "This is me and your great-grandfather," he said. "We were about your age when this was taken. He was like a brother to me." Allie took the photo, her fingers brushing the worn edges of the frame. She stared at the two young men in the picture, their faces full of life and hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." As Allie left the apartment, the weight in her chest felt lighter than it had in weeks. The guilt wasn't entirely gone, but it had transformed into something else, something she could carry with pride instead of shame. She walked down the street, the photo tucked safely in her bag, feeling like she had taken the first step toward becoming the person she wanted to be. And as the sun set over the city, she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget Richard Sullivan, the man who had taught her the true meaning of humility, kindness, and grace.